it's a pleasure for me to have a chat today with Antti Savinainen, our friend from Finland, who's knowledgeable about esoteric matters in that remote for us country. And I think what I'd like to do, Antti, is to start with a rather enigmatic statement made by H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, who at one point remarked, "The light will come from Finland." Would you be able to comment on what you think she may have meant by that?
Well, the first thing to note is that it's not found in any written text. It's an oral kind of a statement provided to Countess Constance Wachtmeister, who was her friend and helper. And Countess Wachtmeister met Pekka Ervast in 1903 in Sweden. And she said to Ervast that this is what Blavatsky told her specifically, and she felt that she needed to tell that to Ervast. What that really means is anybody's guess. I know there are some people here in Finland who think that Pekka Ervast's theosophy and his work was the light, or at least a light. And one could argue that any true theosophy carries light with it. And in that sense, it might be kind of a reasonable statement to be made. But whether it was seen outside or not, I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, you've already mentioned Pekka Ervast, who is one of the leading theosophical lights in Finland in the 20th century. And maybe we could go into who he was and what his work was.
Ervast was born in 1875 into a Swedish-speaking family. We have two official languages here in Finland, Swedish and Finnish. Finnish is a majority, but initially, before we got the independence, for the historical reasons, Swedish-speaking were kind of, how would I put it, charged in administration and most of that kind of business. And he was, at a very young age, he was very good at languages. He learned to speak French at the age of 5 or 6, just reading from a children's book. Of course, one might think perhaps he had some pre-understanding of the language from earlier incarnations, but of course that's speculation. But anyway, he was something like, at the age of 12, he started writing a comparative grammatical study of several languages, at 9 languages even. So he knew Italian, and he knew French, and he knew, of course, English and German, and studied later on Russian, all that. So, but the real tragedy happened at the age of 9 when his mother died. So they were left with his siblings with the care of his father. And of course, that must have been quite a sad situation for any 9-year-old. And then after he graduated from gymnasium, as it says, high school, he started studying at university languages, Romance languages, and Sanskrit. And quite soon he was introduced to Theosophy, and he was a seeker of truth at a very early age. And when he found Sinnett's book, The Occult Word, he started reading it, and he realized that this is something which is true. And he couldn't read any further because it had such a great impact on him. And quite soon he started, after, of course, intense study and perhaps you could say spiritual experiences, and one great spiritual experience, which could be called some kind of rebirth, he started lecturing, giving talks on theosophy and writing articles on newspapers and going to Sweden and giving lecture tours and writing books. And that's when it started. And he kept doing that almost for 40 years.
That's interesting. So he became a leader of the Theosophical movement.
You could say so. In 1907, when he joined the Theosophical Society in 1895 at Yar, and then 1907 Finnish people had their own section, and Ervast was immediately elected to its chairman. So he was the secretary of the Finnish section of Theosophical Society, and he was that for 10 years. And at the end of 1910 decade, he eventually perhaps well, they had some troubles, internal troubles in Finland and perhaps outside Finland in terms of what really is Theosophy, and this led to him to leave Theosophical Society and then start his own organization called the Finnish Rosy Cross. But he was in good terms with his Theosophical friends, and Annie Besant was asked to become an honorary member, and he continued loving and respecting Annie Besant. And of course, the great love of his life was HBB, Blavatsky. And he felt that he's kind of a knight here in this world and trying to defend Blavatsky and her work.
Well, that's fascinating. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Finnish Rosy Cross. For example, what kind of connection does it have to other Rosicrucian movements throughout the world?
Interestingly enough, Ervast chose this name, even though we have no any formal connection whatsoever. But he felt that because this is an esoteric movement which is related more to the Western tradition, that's why he wanted to stress that aspect. And he felt that Christian Rosenkreuz has done remarkable work in this area, and still he has an influence in the esoteric matters for some reason. And the same view is shared by Rudolf Steiner, for instance. But we have no formal connection really. And after the first year in the Finnish Rosy Cross, he didn't refer much to Christian Rosenkreuz. He made some remarks and one presentation to the esoteric circle later on, but it was kind of a background, basically denoting that we are keenly interested in the esoteric Christianity, even though, of course, we study all the religions of the world.
Interesting. Well, if you'd like to, maybe you could go into a little bit of the backstory about Christian Rosenkreuz and Rosicrucianism as you understand it, since this is, as it were, the backdrop against which Ervast started his movement.
Well, there are many such organizations who claim to be authentic, and I'm a bit skeptical about the historical aspect of that. But it seems that in this 17th century, that's we know from history, there were three such kind of literary works which were published, and they made an impact in their time. But it seems that that they offered this, that Rosicrucian brothers existed and they could be looked for and they could be searched for, and they had esoteric knowledge about the world and knowledge about the invisible worlds and all that. And it created a movement and people started looking for them, but it seems that in the known history, nobody really claimed to have found them. Actually, they seem to be, in retrospective, Christian Rosenkreuz and all of those Rosicrucian brothers, like theosophical masters, kind of acting behind the scenes and inspiring people. But then the war broke in Europe, and it was 30 Years' War, and it seemed to have changed the situation dramatically, and they disappeared from the scene and perhaps remained in these secret societies and such. Perhaps in Freemasonry they might have had an influence and so forth.
Yeah, for American viewers, the best known Rosicrucian organization is known by its initials AMORC, the Ancient and Mystical Order of Rosicrucians, which is headquartered in San Jose, California. It was popularized in the early 20th century because they put a lot of ads in magazines like Popular Mechanics and so on. They built an acre sized or maybe larger Rosicrucian Park in downtown San Jose, California, which in those days was farm country and today is the heart of Silicon Valley. They are the best known in the United States, and most people, if they've heard of Rosicrucians, have heard of these Rosicrucians. Now, there were many others. Another was Swinburne Clymer, who certainly detested AMORC and traced his teachings back to a very peculiar American occultist named Beverly Randolph in the 19th century. And then there were Rosicrucians who were in Pennsylvania in the 18th century. I'm giving this for this background for American viewers because that is kind of our context. The as you know, in the European continental context, there are many other organizations, and I certainly don't know enough about to go into those. But anyway, let's go on to esoteric Christianity, which is a major theme of Ervast's work, and I gather yours. Could you say a little bit about what esoteric Christianity is in this context?
Well, there are, of course, many interpretations of that, but one key idea is that it's about ethical commitment in one's life. So Ervast got great inspiration from Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy had quite a stiff interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, but Ervast found that many of his ideas were kind of illuminating, and he shared many of the values that Tolstoy provided in his religious texts. And Ervast followed those instructions in his life from the early age, and he realized that they have the power to change the person, the inner person. They are not so much about the outer behavior, even though of course they are reflected in that area as well, but they are the heart. Do not get angry, remain calm and peaceful, and if you can gradually do that from one day to another, one will learn what goodness is. Kind of when the mind calms down, there is something that could be called goodness, and other people can see that as well. And Ervast claimed that if person does so, he can control his own thoughts. He starts to understand other people better, and people start telling this kind of person their kind of inner ideas and what they really think and so forth. So it has some kind of it's a meditative program actually. From every morning or evening, it depends on the person, one goes through these maxims of life. Be pure in your heart, be honest. Inner honesty is extremely important. Do not resist evil. That has got to do with how we see hardship in life. It's basically understanding karma and seeing that it's a blessing in disguise. And then finally, love everyone, even your enemies. It meant to Ervast, and his rebirth experience stated it clearly that the person who does follow this program can't go to war of any kind. So he was pacifist in this sense, even though he understood that countries do not follow these esoteric Christianity's ideas, but people do, individuals do. So it's something that an individual must decide for him or herself.
Fascinating. Yes, I think that pacifism was certainly very likely to have been part of Tolstoy's influence, because Tolstoy himself embraced pacifism, I think, more or less in the way you just described. And I think that was one of Tolstoy's chief principles in his later life. Well, your associate, Mauri Lehtovirta, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, produced a remarkable work along these lines called The Yoga of Jesus. And in this book, he describes many of the principal maxims of the Sermon on the Mount as means of spiritual practice. Would you like to go into this in a little bit more depth?
I like Mauri's work. I've known Mauri for 35 years or so, and his book, The Yoga of Jesus, is a practical kind of introduction to these ideas. And it's something that the person who doesn't know much about theosophy or esoteric matters or esoteric Christianity, this kind of person can find illumination and perhaps ideas which can be put immediately into practice. And Mauri places his own experience, his own thinking, but he draws to Ervast and Paul Brunton and some other spiritual teachers as well, kind of bringing the Sermon on the Mount through this 21st century, which I really like. And when Mauri asked me years ago, would I like to translate the book into English, in the first place, I said that it's such a great work, and perhaps I'm not able to do that. But when he asked the second time, I decided that I will take it because I immediately loved the book. And I'm so happy that I got you as our editor, and you read the book, audio version. They are all freely distributed because we feel that they have something to offer to people. What's your thinking about the book when you also know the book very well?
Well, I agree very much with what you say, and esoteric Christianity, or what I sometimes call inner Christianity, is an inward matter. The outward Christianity is about, well, it's what the writers of the New Testament, Paul, called the law. This is external observances, which, as the New Testament makes very clear, only goes so far. And if you don't have that internal transformation, which I could say Christianity is pointing toward, you're just following the rules in a rather mechanical way. And so what I thought was remarkable about Maori's work was that it actually takes these maxims and, as you say, make them a very spiritual practice. How do you, shall we say, turn the other cheek in practical terms? How do you avoid reactions? My understanding of esoteric Christianity is that a lot of it has to do with the passions, which are like impulses, your immediate response, usually of anger, that you have to be aware of and integrate rather than just expressing externally. And I think his book very much points to that, and I think it's very useful. Another thing that I think is of interest is that more than most books on esoteric Christianity, I think an ordinary believer, the usual Catholic, Protestant faiths can work with it because it doesn't have a lot of the esoteric Christian doctrines that many organizations and individuals have. Does that make sense to you?
Very much so, indeed. And he does have this idea of karma and reincarnation as a background, because some of these ideas are hard to understand without it. But I once asked a friend who is a Christian, doesn't believe in reincarnation, to watch one of Mauri's video presentation on honesty, the third maxim. And he watched it and he said that he could almost agree with everything he said, only the part of karma and reincarnation, which he referred to a little bit, but not much. And said something like 95% was something that he felt is true Christianity to him. And it was a nice statement, because my friend doesn't agree with Theosophy at all, but he could see that these ideas are something that belong to every Christian person, no matter what kind of other beliefs he or she may hold.
Very true. Well, certainly the notion of karma itself appears in the Bible. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap, in Galatians. In the Old Testament, they have sown the wind and will reap the whirlwind. So the idea of karma per se is not opposed to Christianity. Most Christians, it is true, do not accept reincarnation. Although I will point out that surveys in the United States have, and this is pretty consistent over the last couple of decades, about 20 to 25% of Americans believe in reincarnation. And I even saw one in which a higher proportion of American Catholics believe in reincarnation than the population in general, even though, as you know, it's reincarnation is denied by the Catholic Church. So even the idea of reincarnation is permeated even into Christianity in the United States anyway. I don't know, of course, what's going on in Finland, but it is interesting. And many people obviously consider Christianity quite compatible with the idea of reincarnation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the general religious life in Finland today. esoteric and general. I mean, what I think you call the evangelical church, or what we would call the Lutheran church, is the dominant established religion, and it has most adherents. Could you say a little bit about its role in Finnish life and sensibility?
Yes, in 1923, Finland had a freedom of choice in terms of religion. Before that, everybody had to belong to the Lutheran Church or the Orthodox Church, and perhaps one could be a Jewish as well. But that was it. And practically almost everybody was part of the Lutheran Church. But after that, things have changed. And within 20 years, the amount of people belonging to the Lutheran Church has drastically dropped. It's now something like 2/3. It used to be 85%, even some 20 years ago. And nowadays, people typically are not that attached to church at all. I mean, people go to church perhaps for baptism or some wedding or funerals, but they really don't care much about it. It's like a tradition for many people. And it seems that all the churches and actually all the formal organizations for that matter, including theosophical organizations, people are not that attracted to them anymore. Spiritual searching hasn't disappeared in Finland, just like I suppose it hasn't in other parts of the world either. But it doesn't look for the forms which are kind of these traditional churches or organizations.
Well, that makes sense. It's certainly very similar to the case of the United States. This kind of general antipathy toward organizations as a whole. Do you have any idea from a personal sense of why that should be? It seems like people are going more toward an individual rather than a group approach. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be the case?
Well, of course, it's something that we have thought about and talked about quite a lot, because it means as well that we used to have hundreds of members in our little society. Now there are less than 200. And the same applies to the Theosophical Society, which I'm in very good terms with. I have friends there and I talk to them, and we publish articles in each other's journals and so forth. So people get old, and not many new young people come in. I think it's kind of a zeitgeist at the moment. And I once had a chat with a young lady who is my relative actually, and she told me that we young people, we are interested in these like tolle and meditation and kind of spiritual things, but we are definitely not going to join anything which would kind of restrict their freedom. And I fully understand that. It seems to be that something which is in the western part of the globe, some kind of the tide of the time. And the thing is, what we can offer for these searching people, young people and old alike. So even though all these organizations seem to be reduced in terms of number of members, but I think that churches and we little organizations, we can offer something, because we have traditions which have something worth preserving. But how to meet these people who don't want to get attached that's of course the internet. For instance, that Mauri's work, The Yoga of Jesus, which you read as an audiobook, has received 13,000 views. Not all go through all the pages, but many of them do. And it seems that if we have a kind of a theosophical lecture or presentation, there might be 10 people present or 15 people if we're lucky, but then it might turn out that there are hundreds of people who view it from the internet later on afterwards. So there are people who want to hear about these things, but they want to do it in their own privacy. Mm-hmm. Do you have any explanation?
Yes, that's very similar to the situation of the Theosophical Society in America, because here the membership has been reasonably stable at around 3,000 for a number of years now. But again, we have live gatherings where comparatively few people attend, but YouTube lectures interviews very much like this one, including this one, sometimes they get up to hundreds of thousands of views. So people obviously want to absorb this in their own time and on their own terms. So that corresponds very closely, I think, to much of the American scene. So that's well, let's turn to one important aspect of the Finnish heritage, which I certainly have always found fascinating, which is the Kalevala, which is kind of the great Finnish epic collected by, what is it, Laius Lönnrot in
Yes.
the 19th century out of Finnish legends. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it is. And there's also an esoteric dimension to it, which Pekka Ervast commented on. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Kalevala and what its deeper meanings are.
In the early 19th century, people started to realize that there are many people in the countryside who can tell runos, kind of poetry, ancient sounding poetry, and they started collecting them, going into distances with skis and walking and with horse, trying to find out typically old people who could sing many songs. And Elias Lönnrot was the most prominent of those, but there were others as well. And he was a doctor, medical doctor, so he could help these people in his travels in other ways as well. And he gathered, or we could say he gathered so much of this poetry that eventually he felt that he could put it together. And the Kalevala was published, the version we nowadays know, in 1849, and it contains 23,000 lines of poetry. So it's quite a large collection. And some of those lines were devised by Elias Lönnrot himself, because he kind of saw the grand story behind, because he had only fractions. He had dozens of people who provided some parts. So he was the last true singer in Kalevala. And it had a huge impact to Finnish people, because it kind of gave us, I wasn't, of course, in the scene at the time, but gave the Finns a lot of national pride that we do have this long tradition, even before Christianity. And there is something valuable, like in the Greeks have Ilias and Odyssey, and many other countries have their own national epics, and this was the Finnish one. And it started to be recognized abroad as well. We were part of Russia at the time, and even though we had autonomy, but it gave national pride, which you might say was one factor leading eventually 1970 to Finnish independence. Kalevala played its role. And Ervast, coming from this Swedish-speaking family, even though he was a genius, you could say, in languages, it took him some time to master the Finnish language. And he couldn't initially understand this Kalevala text, but he had a friend in Theosophical Society who lectured about this, and then he learned Finnish from the first Finnish author, Aleksis Kivi, who is available also in other languages. And then he got into the spirit of this Kalevala. And actually, this might sound a bit kind of unbelievable, perhaps to some, but I'll tell it anyway, because people at the time felt or believed that it's possible to be conscious in other worlds, invisible worlds, not just in this world. And Ervast realized that this Kalevala magic and Kalevala, the power of Kalevala, is still alive in the other world as well. And he got into contact with that source, and it opened his eyes so he could see what Kalevala is all about. And the name of the book, which he wrote in 1916, is called The Key to the Kalevala. And the key is, which is not a big surprise, it's Theosophy. And there's creating of the world myth, and then there are three divine powers, which in Kalevala are called Väinämöinen, Ilmarinen, and Lemminkäinen. Will, and then intellect and emotion. And they have these they are cosmic forces on one hand, and they are these features of every human being on the other hand. And then Ervast kind of fitted this theosophical idea of initiation and what it takes to get the contact with the higher self. And in Kalevala, when I read it, it seems to me that yes, there is this thread. And I've corresponded with a person who does Kalevala research from completely other perspective, and he wrote to me that they recognize Ervast's contribution, even though they feel that sometimes he went too far with his interpretation, but there is some value in it, and he occasionally addresses in his lectures. And Ervast talks about this the way of preparation, and he calls that works for wages, which are in Kalevala. And there are three such works of wages. And the first one is to plow the field of adders, so kind of snakes. What does it mean? It means to this mind of the person is filled with thoughts and emotions which are impure, and that must be cleansed. And what can be done to do that is to have the worldview which is made with best concepts and ideas, and which correspond, of course, how things really are. And it means about finding the way to calm the mind. And there's a story that Ilmarinen is seeking for this maid of Pohja, who in Ervast's interpretation is the higher self. And Ilmarinen gets advice from the maid of Pohja that forge yourself a golden plow. That will help you to take care of those adders in the field. And there are other such feats which must be achieved. And Ilmarinen finishes all these three tasks, which correspond to day consciousness and dream consciousness and inner consciousness in Ervast's interpretation. And he will join the maid of Pohja in the wedding and has the union with that, which is in theosophical terms the initiation. But that's just the first part of the Kalevala. Then there is Sampo, which is the source of all ancient wisdom and spiritual knowledge. And from the other point of view, it's the immortal resurrection body. One could say a rainbow body. And that is what Väinämöinen is looking for in Ilmarinen. And they go to Pohjola, and it's kind of hidden in Pohjola, which is the north, which is the meaning the north, and it's guarded by this black magic, the black magic mistress Louhi, who is very keen on not letting it to the hands of other people. And eventually they manage to get Sampo, and there are of course different phases again which must be met. And they correspond in Ervast's interpretation of getting consciousness in the invisible worlds. But eventually the Sampo is lost in the final battle at the sea. And Väinämöinen initially is sad for that, but then he realizes that it's a good thing that now these little parts of Sampo will go all over the world and provide good things and blessings for every person, not just the one person, which would be the initiate. And Ervast sees in that kind of that this was achieved, this Sampo, but it happened in the New Testament in the resurrection of Jesus, and it takes contact with the esoteric Christianity. It's a nice story, actually.
Wow. Well, that's very impressive. That's remarkable. Well, the Sampo is envisaged as kind of nil. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And Ilmarinen is the one who forges the Sampo, and it can produce all goods, possible goods that one man could imagine. So in the Kalevala story.
Yeah, I mean, some interpreters have equated the Sampo with the world axis. You know, that is, it's something that turns around, but I don't know how that would relate to Ervast's interpretation. One thing in your account that interested me was the witch who guards the Sampo. And this would seem to point to a common theme in esotericism, which could be equated with the guardian of the threshold. There is some dark thing standing in the way between you and, shall we say, the high self or illumination. Is that what you think that's trying to say?
I quite like that idea because Ervast talks about this threshold, guardian of the threshold, in a similar manner, that before the person is ready, the purification process must go far enough that one can go into the invisible world. And I'd like to mention about Rudolf Steiner's contribution. His kind of one of the main works has an outstanding description of the lower and higher guardian of the threshold. And they correspond quite well with Ervast's interpretation as well. Of course, Ervast had read the book and he met Steiner and was not knew what he was about. But it is one interpretation that there is this guardian. But in a way, the guardian is a good thing because it prevents the person getting too early his or hands with the occult knowledge, because that could wreak a lot of havoc and create bad things in the world because it has such great power. So in a way, the guardian works for the benefit of the person.
Yes, but I think it's a reasonable thing. It's sort of what keeps the higher material from coming down and overwhelming you before you're ready. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think that's interesting. Well, the dweller of the threshold really comes into the esoteric imagination through Bulwer Lytton's novel Zanoni, which was published, well, in the mid-19th century. And Bulwer Lytton himself was widely believed to be a Rosicrucian initiate. So Steiner saw himself as part of the Rosicrucian tradition. So that concept of the dweller of the threshold is very much part of what one may call Rosicrucianism as we know it today. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I know Zanoni, and it's a fascinating piece of work, and it's interesting to compare that with the other descriptions. Blavatsky also talked about this guardian of the threshold, and initially, I think it goes to Aeneas, the Greek mythology. There is the first description of the. I can't cite that in English because I read it in Finnish, but there's an, and that has been used as a kind of an archetype of the guardian of the threshold. So it might go even deeper into history than well-written Zanoni, which is something which every theosophist should read.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it comes from Virgil's account of the underworld. Is a famous line from, what is it? The descent to hell is easy, but to retrace your steps and come back, that's the task. So that may be some relevance to it. Well, anyway, but do the Finnish Theosophists have a great deal of contact with other sections of the Theosophical Society?
Yes, it started quite early on in 1987. Before that, people had perhaps friends in other organizations, personal contacts, but nothing kind of official took place. In 1987, the first gathering was devised, and it was about a Finnish forest. That was thought to be the theme that everybody could agree on. And it happened to be in my hometown where I was at the time in 1980s. I didn't meet these people. I was just studying theosophy and these ideas, but they had two more seminars, and I attended the third one and had discussions with theosophists and people from the anthroposophical circles. And later on, they have had different types of meetings. So it has continued from the 1990s, even today. A couple of years ago, I was in a seminar giving a speech on near-death experience and reincarnation studies, and the General Secretary of Theosophical Society, Janne Vuonnonvirta, was there, and one person was from the Anthroposophical Society, and we had a cordial meeting and contributed to all these topics. And I think that it has meant that, for instance, some of the books I produced, we've done together with people from different branches of Theosophical kind of movement in Finland. It seems to be a natural way to work with. I don't care really if we have some differences in opinion, because not many of us know very much in terms of esoteric knowledge. I mean, we of course have read about them, but really know from personal experience, that is another matter. So, I'm glad that I could join the New York section of Theosophical Society. There was a Zoom meeting, and it was I feel that all people in the world, of course, we are brothers, axiomatically speaking, but even more so because we are part of the same movement. So this inspires me. When I was something like 20 years old, when I started reading these books, I'm now 56. In the initial view was that this is wonderful, that there are people who are looking for the spiritual in the same sense. So I think that Finland might be a small example in this one, how we can work together and having seminars together and produce write these others journals and articles, and then have kind of brotherly connection with each other.
I think that's very true. Well, Tim Wyatt is a British theosophist, and he actually wrote an article for our magazine Quest, in which he said, well, actually, all of this Zoom online stuff has brought people together in a way that they'd never been brought together before, because now people from any country can attend a meeting, and it's actually opened things up, even though initially it seemed to close things down as a result of the pandemic. So yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. That makes a great deal of sense. Maybe we could go on to another subject that Ervast treated, and I think you've treated at some length in your own work, which is the after-death states. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about those. I think they're slightly different from those in standard theosophical works, but maybe you could go on your own view and Ervast's view of these after-death states.
Yes, we realized that with my friends that Ervast had something special to say about after-death stages, and we gathered together a book called From Death to Rebirth. And incidentally, you edited that book, which I'm so grateful. And of course, Ervast gave a lecture series of lectures of this topic from many occasions, and he wrote quite a lot about this death, what happens in afterlife. And we decided that we try to put together a kind of a chronological order and put together kind of a story what happens. And of course, we had to leave something out and decide what is kind of a contribution to the main theme. And the main story, of course, is quite the same, but Ervast, one could say that he was a clairvoyant, and he could, well, in the sense that he could see and investigate these topics. That's what his memoirs, for instance, he tells how this happened, that he was first going through the meditative training and then had training how to work in the invisible world. And perhaps one such feature for Theosophists might be interesting to notice that when the death process begins, typically there is life review, which we know from near-death experiences as well. And Ervast explains that in detail, what's going on. And the main thing is that there is the personality is illuminated with light coming from the higher self. And that's why the person can judge his or her actions and the moral value of that objectively without being attached emotionally to those, whatever happened and what kind of things the person has done. And after that life review, the higher self leaves the personality, and the personality is left not on its own devices really, but still just as a personality with no immortal aspect of direct contact with that anymore. And incidentally, there's only one source where I have found this idea, and it's the Mahatma letters. There is the same idea is expressed in the Mahatma letters. It might be somewhere else, but I haven't found it. And then what happens, this personality needs to go through the life again. In the life review, it took place in the great light from the beginning to the end. And after that, what happens, it's the other way around, from the last incidents to the birth, and then back what happened before we were born, which is perhaps another aspect which is not often stated, that the person goes through the life what happened before he or she was born. And then it means that there is suffering, because in the second case, when this life is lived through, the person feels everything that he caused to other people. If evil things took place, violent things took place, every aspect is felt. And then it's in the astral world, which is the world of the emotions. There is no physical body which would prevent them from taking place, and it can be very tough. But the person is not alone in this one, and this is sometimes called, perhaps a hard word to pronounce, purgatory. How would you say it? Purgatory.
Purgatory.
Yes, and it means purification, and it can go pass through rather quickly if the person realizes what's going on. A little bit like in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. If the person realizes what's going on, there's some control over it. And especially if the person has lived a life which contains some kind of character enhancing aspect, some kind of virtues that has been tried to live, and it might help the person to act in a bit more free way in that other word. And it's not just about prisoner of his or her own mind. But the thing is that this kind of explanation what's going on, Ervast mentions that it increased dramatically after the Theosophical movement came to the world, because many people started reading about these things, started thinking about these things, and perhaps self-educating themselves so they can be of help when they go to the other side. And then after the purification has taken place, the person has become kind of a child again, at least internally inside, and has lived through the life and suffered all the sufferings, and found the kind of what is left is the good with the personality, everything that is good. And then the second death arises. This is also in the Mahatma letters described. And then the person will need to have a union with his or her higher self as a personality, kind of what happened in the Kalevala and in initiation, which will take place here on the earth. It happens for everybody in the afterlife stages. And then the life starts in heaven. And then again, one lives his or her life from the beginning to the end, but everything good that has taken place is now fulfilled. And the happiness is reached, which could be called bliss. Everyone gets as much as they can carry. But at some point, this personal heaven must come to an end. And then now we could say the upper manas in theosophical language, or the Atma Buddhi, that aspect of the human being which is truly immortal, it can take only the best in the person. And if there's not much kind of these qualities which can stand the immortal life, then the personality dies. And that happens to most of the people. And it's a good thing, really. Once you start thinking about it, it's a good thing that this personality, which is not perfect in any way, but has something good in it. Everybody has some good in it. That will remain, and it's a new leaf in the book of life, and enhances the higher self. And then, based on karma, then the new incarnation takes place, which allows the person to pursue for the ideals and try to live the life in a better way than what took place in the earlier incarnation. So initially, the person loses the higher self, the great light, but finally, everyone basically will reach it again. But then one must come back, because perfection is the ideal, not perfection of the personality, but perfection of the human being.
Well, that's very comprehensive. It certainly generally parallels the theosophical teachings of Kamaloka, which is kind of a purgatory, and Devachan, which is kind of a heaven. And I think it also talks to another question that faces us when we admit that there's immortality. You know, the human spirit is immortal. In a way, I think everybody really knows that. But that said, a lot of what makes us up is not immortal. The body is not, it's just not going to live. And then all of the things that are associated with the body, its preoccupations, its desires, its function in human life. I mean, I sometimes, say, all right, well, are you going to be a Republican or a Democrat when you're dead? Why would you possibly care? And, the process I think that you're describing speaks to that very eloquently, because there is something about us that's immortal and something that's very mortal. And how do we tease that out? And something about the after death states seems to be about that. So that's really that's quite remarkable. So well, I don't know. I kind of come to the end of my questions. Do you have anything you want to add or subtract for that matter?
I mentioned about near-death experiences, and there's 50 years of research which has been done in that area, recounting of people's experiences, and some of the best research has been done immediately after the experience. So there is no time lag between, no delay, and there's an emerging picture of the whole process. There are differences, but the main kind of the big picture is something which is quite consistent with the theosophical view. Of course, up to the point it reaches, but the life review and people coming to greed and the lightness and happiness and this kind of the first stage, the great light state. When I had discussions with people who come from this perspective to these esoteric or spiritual matters, they don't often want to hear about what happens next. I mean, they think that it will continue as such. It was a surprise to me because I didn't think about that beforehand. But anyway, it offers some kind of objective marking point or kind of a benchmark what we can compare these theosophical ideas with. And this seems to be quite consistent. Another aspect which is important is Stevenson's and others' work in terms of children who seem to remember their past lives. Of course, from the point of view theosophy, it's common sense really is that you can't be reincarnating after half a year or after 2 years. Everybody can't do that. It's just not mathematically possible in terms of bodies, really. So, and Buddhists have their way of getting around this because they can be reincarnating in six different lokas, so they don't have this problem. And human form is only one kind of rare instance, but it means that there are special cases. But it seems that some honest skeptics even they can confess that yes, Stevenson's data is something we can't get away so easily. So, but of course there are some who think that it's easily explained away. So, and I know the theosophical movement has taken keen interest on these topics and asked these researchers come to talk into seminars, and you have also had people who have experienced near that or something like that, which I think is quite important, because this is one aspect that where we can be of service to others, is that we can take contact with the people who have similar ideas or something which is parallel to what we are aiming at. So then perhaps we can provide some food for thought, some esoteric interpretations which might help, do I dare to say, even the scientists in this area to have new hypotheses to be tested.
Well, that leads to another question, which is, well, your professional background is actually in physics. And like many of the sciences, physics seems to be, well, at least it used to be, relentlessly materialistic. And there's a great barrier in scientific thinking to consider anything that is non-material. Do you see any of that changing? How's the world of physics shifting and adapting to its own discoveries?
Well, it is true that not many people outside of physics have really grasped how much the idea of what kind of universe we are living in changed in the 1905 and then 1920s when quantum mechanics came. 1905, Einstein had his theory of relativity. So the universe we live in is vastly different from the billiard ball model where we just kind of gathered together as little balls, tiny, tiny balls you can't see. So in that way, there's a huge difference, and the world looks very different. Time isn't now when you are sitting on your desk, your head feels different time than your feet because you're in gravitational field. So the head is getting ever so slightly older than your feet. And interestingly enough, this effect can be measured in a laboratory even within a couple of tens centimeters, less than a meter. One can measure it with atomic clocks, how the time really is different in different locations. And even small speeds, like 10 meters per second, even less, that has an effect as well, which can be measured in a lab. So what I really love about physics is that it produces testable predictions, which can be then tested against in experiments, and we can ask nature, do you like this idea, or is it some other way? And when the technology evolves, we can ask even more eloquent questions. But my experience is that physicists as such tend to be, they are different type of materialistic people in the sense that many top physicists, they don't believe in anything, but their worldview is weird. I mean, in the same way as with Theosophists might look to the other people, because they know so much. And I'm quite hesitant of for trying to forge together spiritual worldview and scientific one, but it might that it has eluded many people how deep changes have taken place. And what's the good thing about is that that they can be tested and new technology can be invented based on these earlier findings, which were initially very theoretical. Something which was theorized in 1950s is now something which can be done in labs every day. And quantum mechanics is something which is worth studying even if the person is not a physicist. It's a fascinating topic. But of course, mathematics is needed if one wants to go further with it. A lot of that.
The physicist Richard Feynman said that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. So, well, I certainly don't understand quantum mechanics. I think we can wrap up after this, if you like, is one thing that is emerging in kind of the discourse is this idea that's brooded about in physics that now consciousness is said to be the basis of the universe. And one sees this in various scientific or popular scientific things. What do you think of this whole concept?
I think that is perhaps the greatest mystery we have in science. We have dark energy and dark matter, but they are smaller mysteries than consciousness. And I think that many scientists who don't believe in metaphysical ideas as such, they acknowledge that. It hasn't been explained. I've read some books in which they state that they have explained it away, but in reality, it hasn't taken place. So it's still an open question. And I believe that the spiritual ideas have something to contribute to the discussion at some point. Perhaps that is not now, but there is something to be said about that. And some quite clever people in science have said that we are forced to acknowledge that there is consciousness even at the material level of the universe. Even the rocks and even atoms have some kind of consciousness, not the kind of consciousness as we do, but they feel that they can't explain the nature of ourselves and animals and even plants without this idea, which I think is not too far away from what we believe in theosophy.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, one of the most insightful books on this subject was written by an erstwhile theosophist named Alice Bailey called The Consciousness of the Atom. And, this was written in the early 1920s. So it was far in advance of what many people were thinking at the time. In any case, well, I think we've come to the end of our time. I think it's been a fascinating, very diverse conversation, and I certainly appreciate your taking the time to do it and share your knowledge with us.
Thank you for asking me to do this, and I appreciate your friendship. I think it's my good karma that I have been able to work with you, and I feel so much love for the theosophists around the world, and perhaps especially those in America. And Tim White, you mentioned, he's also a friend of mine. And there are not many people around the world who do this, but I think we are a brotherhood, just like all the humanity is. So that's the key idea in theosophy. Thank you all.
Very good. Thanks very much.